Other end of the scale then is to work in an environment where people are dealing with very vulnerable people, working in situations which are quite tricky. They may be under-resourced. Quite a lot of people maybe feel negative or at best ambivalent about some of the things that happens within the public sector, but I think we overlook its ability to innovate and its ability to experiment and make breakthroughs at our peril. So I'm really pleased that Rob Stewart from Scottish Social Services Council has joined us to tell us about how they've taken a slightly different approach to utilising technology to drive learning forward in a service which, if you ever do need it, you really, really want people to have been well trained and well developed within it. So without further ado, welcome Rob Stewart, please.
Thank you. The last time I gave a presentation like this was to an audience in Canada, and they had subtitles so they could understand what I was saying. Now, unfortunately, we don't have that luxury today, so if you can't understand a word I say, please put your hand up and let me know afterwards, and I'll try and translate as best I can. I suppose before we really talk about creating a culture of engagement, it's important to think about what is engagement, what do we mean by that? And when I go out and talk to employers in our sector, it's important that we're on the same definition of what engagement is, because engagement, where I come from previously in public relations, is about getting eyes on the screen, about getting people to actually consume your message. But in terms of learning, we're thinking about how do people actually change their practice? How do they improve? How do we see real-world improvement based on what people have consumed in terms of our learning resources? So engagement for us isn't just someone we get 1,000 hits to one of our resources. Engagement to us is that we get 1,000 stories about the difference that resource has made to practice. The organisation I work for is called the Scottish Social Services Council. We're often confused with a local authority, but we aren't. We are a regulatory body. We regulate 200,000 people in the social services sector. Of that, around 100,000 of them are required to be registered with us in order to do their jobs. So we're not a membership body where people might choose to be a member of the body in order to improve their practice. We're an organisation who people have to register with in order to work in their job, and that can have a big impact on engagement, because for a lot of people they will see us as being a faceless body who they have to register with in order just to have a livelihood. I've highlighted my favourite bit, which is the bit that we do. We support professional development within the sector. That can sometimes mean creating learning resources, but more importantly it's about how do we help people become better learners, and by that is how do we help people be better than the person they were yesterday. When I talk about who our learners are, that can be quite confusing, because I don't work in an organisation where we have a very set audience. Our audience can change. They work across 13,000 different services, and we don't engage with all of them. They can be nursery workers looking after children in a large nursery environment. They could be childminders working alone. They could be people working in care at home. They can be people working in care homes. They can be social workers. Out of that, we'll have people who have degree-level qualifications before they register with us, and we'll have people who have no qualifications at all, who may have come in straight from school. Perhaps after a career break, they may have come in and their last experience of formal learning might have been high school, and it may not necessarily have been a positive experience. 85% of our registrants are women, and the bulk of them will work part-time. People in our sector are very low paid. That also has an impact on how much learning they can actually undertake, because a lot of courses cost money, and if your employer can't put you on a particular course, it's unlikely somebody would be able to afford to do it themselves. I suppose like any other regulatory body, we have a focus on CPD, and I remember when I started in my role in learning and development at the SSSC, I read an article in Training Journal, I think it was a blog post on the website, and it was quite a critique of how regulatory bodies and professional bodies do CPD, in the fact that we'd ask people registered with us to submit, perhaps every 3 or 4 years when their registration's up for renewal, a list of all the things that they've done over the last couple of years that have improved their practice. And regardless of what someone submits, we will accept it and will allow them to be on the register forevermore. And if that's something that we did, then people really wouldn't have any incentive to improve on who they were yesterday. So what's the kind of things that, when I started 5 years ago, and I started, one of my jobs as a learning and development advisor was to assess what people submitted in these PRTL logs. And this is what we got back from some people. I would say this isn't what the majority of people gave us, but a large proportion of people who submitted their reflective logs, it was obvious that they had done this over the last couple of days. So someone might have had 5 years to compile these and tell us all the difference that their training had made to them over the last 5 years. It would come in a few days before, and we get people saying, look, I don't have the time to do this. We get people who say, what is reflective writing? And that's quite a valid question, because if we've got people joining our sector straight from high school or with no formal training before, how would people know what reflective writing is? It's a really different way of recording your learning. This is probably the most important one. It was my employer hasn't sent me to enough training to make the PRTL hours. Sorry, I should have said PRTL is what we call CPD. It's post-registration training and learning. Another common one, I'm only doing this because you told me to. So that kind of tells you all you want to know about how engaged that learner is. Meanwhile, while this has been happening out in the sector, because funding for organizations isn't what it used to be, digital learning has really started to take off. And people have done this simply because it's cheaper, not because it brings any benefit that they didn't have before. I think there's real benefits in replacing some face-to-face training with digital learning, because we can really focus on learning transfer. But organizations are adopting digital learning because they simply don't have the budgets they had before. By trade, I'm a website developer. The principle of my trade is don't make me think. So the whole point is I spent years training how to build things that people could use without even having to think about how they were using them. That is an incredibly dangerous principle when you apply it to digital learning. But so many of the resources that I've seen created by organizations in our sector are exactly like that. You've probably had experience of them yourself. It's the type of e-learning where it's a glorified PowerPoint. Someone sits and they click next, next, next. At the end, they'll get a quiz. And even in the office, we have competitions over how quickly we can complete some of these things without taking in any of the knowledge and still pass the quiz at the end. In fact, I had one developer tell me, he said, what did you think of the e-learning? I said, oh, I completed it in 5 minutes and I got 80% in the quiz. And he said, oh, that's great, you must have already known this stuff. I don't know the first thing about how the telephone system works. But it was that easy to get through it because the questions at the end of the quiz were just common sense. So our approach in the SSSC's digital learning team was to create some resources that we could show to the sector that would give people kind of a taste of how different things can be when it comes to digital learning. So we started off with interactive workbooks. Now, in the social services sector, workbooks in the past used to be big A3 ring binders. They would be full of stuff, normally about 80 or 70 pages, and of course right at the back in cellophane would be the pages that were sent out as corrections, which never even got taken out of the cellophane but stayed in the back. There would be, I think to begin with, VHS videotapes and then DVDs. In fact, I think right up until 2010 there were still some training manuals that came with VHS tape. And people couldn't get anything to play them on. Audio CDs as well. And what would happen is these things were so big, they'd just get stuck on a shelf and they would stay there. But there was a benefit to those in that you could actually take them back into your workplace and use them in the workplace. We wanted to have things on tablets and e-books in particular because we didn't want social workers or social service workers to be taken out of their normal environment. Say, for instance, that's a nursery. Why would you take a nursery nurse out of the shop floor and put her in an office in front of a computer to click next for half an hour? That's not situated learning. Also with our interactive workbooks, there's a lot of content in there, but the content isn't the learning. The real learning happens from the activities. And if we had someone sitting at a PC and we had an activity midway through the learning and it said, go and speak to your colleagues or go and do a walkthrough of your workplace, if it was health and safety, which I think is the app we've got up there, the person's not going to do that. They're going to click next, and they're going to move on to the next thing. But with the workbook, they can actually have a walk around, do a health and safety assessment, write down what they're saying. They can actually start to put some of the learning into practice. We love interactive video simulations, and so do our learners. We have a whole series of simulations around our codes of practice. Every registrant has to abide by the codes of practice, and we wanted to show them scenarios where we worked with our fitness to practice team to figure out what are the common things that people do that aren't intentional, that cause them to fall foul of the codes of practice, where they might end up in a fitness to practice hearing as a result. And these video simulations, which are really just, some of them are quite dramatic. Some of them do seem like an episode of EastEnders, but people enjoy them and they work their way through. And what happens is you're presented with a scenario, you're given options, and depending on the options you choose, the scenario takes a different turn. So it's a bit like a make-your-own-adventure book from the 1980s. It's remarkable how many people will intentionally choose the wrong thing just to see what happens, but they're very popular. We have performance support apps which might exist on a smartphone, because most of our workers might have access to a smartphone, even if they don't have access to anything else. So we have things like our Adult Support and Protection app. It's a small smartphone app that kind of explains people's legal responsibilities around that act, but also gives them some background information. So if you've been working with a client and you've got some suspicions that they may be being abused, you can easily call up that smartphone app and see what your legal obligations are under that situation. So it's kind of what we call performance support, and it's been an incredibly popular app. We also insist on work-based activities over quizzes, and that's probably one of the most important things for us. None of our learning resources have quizzes at the end. We are using quizzes to test people at the start to get an indication of where people might be, to try and get an indication if they're overconfident or underconfident about a subject, but not at the start. And importantly, and this has an impact on how I can measure the success of our resources, we aren't allowed to put anything behind a login. So we can't charge people for our learning materials. We can't put them on a learning management system behind a login. The reason that we can't do that is because for many of our learners, if you have to create an account to use something, or if you have to use a learning management system, they won't do it. So to increase the number of people using that, it's just got to be available. Now, in the beginning, we like to count things, and this has come up so often over the last 2 days. We counted everything, and my KPIs would be, you've launched that app, how many downloads of that app have there been? And I would happily go and say, oh, we've had 900 downloads of that app since we launched it. Isn't that wonderful? Unfortunately, I had a really good manager who would come along and tell me, what does that mean? What's the impact? Have people actually used that? Has it been useful to them? I think, well, I don't know. 900 people have downloaded it, though, and that's great. It was clear that we had to start getting information, and what I would have done in the past is I would have created a survey. So if you used the learning resource, I would just survey you and what you thought of it, and did it make a difference? But how does that help the learner put any of that into practice? How did that wouldn't have aided learning transfer. 5 years ago, when we were thinking about this, Mozilla Open Badges were quite a big thing. We were hearing a lot of people speak about them. We had people in our sector who wanted us to use Open Badges to give them some sort of recognition for the informal learning that they were doing. We were veering away from it because what we saw out in the sector where badges were being used is they were being used poorly. For instance, if you came to this conference today and I gave you an open badge for attendance, what would that tell anyone? But if I asked you to write a few hundred words about what you're taking away from today and what you're going to do when you're back in the workplace tomorrow, or even ask you to say, well, what difference did that make? And if I used what you had written and gave you a badge for that, that would potentially be more important. And that's what we wanted to do. So we built a system where we could do that. Now, badges, I don't want to talk too much about the technology behind this, because the technology isn't important, but just imagine that if you give us that written statement, a human will look at that, not a computer. They'll look at it, they'll give you advice on it, let you know if what you've written is okay or not. And then we'd award a badge. Now, for the majority of the people who use our platform, they don't use the Open Badges feature. They just simply print a certificate at the end. And what we do differently is our certificates have a QR code. So if I were to take my certificate and show it to Robin and say, I've got this great certificate for being here today, Robin could scan that QR code with his phone and immediately go back and see the written evidence that I supplied in order to get the badge. One of the things that we do is we allow badges that have been awarded to people to be endorsed. So for every badge, a learner will get their own web page. That web page will show the criteria of what they did to get that badge, their evidence that they've supplied, but also you can then endorse that. So if I want to show evidence of how I've put learning into practice and how I've changed, I can get my manager, I could get people who use my service to add endorsements, a bit like a LinkedIn testimonial to that page, so all of that information is contained there. If you want to find out more about it, badges.sssc.uk.com is the place to go. If you look for the Getting Started videos, that will tell you all you want to know about how open badges work. But the important thing here is we had issues with people keeping their PRTL, keeping their CPD. So we wanted to help learners get better at reflective writing. We wanted to help learners think about how the thing they've just worked on, how the piece of learning they've just undertaken, how that gets applied in practice. So we asked people to write about that. Now you might think, well, Rob, if you get 100 of these coming back in, how do you give actual feedback on that? And well, I'd be lying if I said we gave individual feedback to every single one. What we've done is we've looked at over the course of around 10,000 submissions, what are the things people get wrong? What are the things people do really well? And how do we create short bits of feedback that will help people who are doing the wrong things do the right things? And that process of very quickly, and what we try and do is within 28 days of a submission, we try and give somebody some feedback that will help them. Now think about this, with our old PRTL system, and though we still do this, you might wait 5 years before I take a look at what you're submitting to tell you that isn't good enough. Now within a few days, you get that, and you can actually take action. You probably still remember enough about the learning experience to go and do something in practice as a result. It's important to say that nearly everybody who gets a badge returned because the information wasn't good enough will resubmit within a few days and have the badge awarded either on the second attempt or the third attempt. While assessing these submissions for open badges, we realized something else, that we could actually answer the question about what impact did the learning resources that we spent a lot of money on actually make. And we do that through stories. Now, I think it was Andy in the panel yesterday had talked about how important it was that we use stories and qualitative information as well as quantitative information and volumetric information to talk about the difference that resources make. We now have that. In fact, out of the 10,000 open badges we've awarded to date, we have 2.5 million words of learner-submitted evidence, all of which backs up the impact on practice that some of our resources have had. But there's always a but with these things. Things didn't work quite as well as we had expected. As soon as we launched the badges platform, we started to notice some common trends. People had become so used to digital learning being a passive experience where they don't need to think, that if you give someone a tablet app that's full of content, they'll simply sit down and read it and just ignore all the activities. And we wouldn't have known that that had happened unless we had started capturing reflective accounts from learners, because a lot of the submissions we looked at for the health and safety app were just our content regurgitated to us, maybe paraphrased here and there, but people were focusing on the difference the content had made rather than the difference the activities had made. This actually was a real submission we got in. Someone said this was an excellent app and we'll put everything we've read into practice. It shows some of the common things we would return a badge submission for. One, it's not written in first person, and there's a real reason why we push first person in everything that gets submitted. The same question came back up. What is reflective writing? Because we had launched this platform to capture evidence from learners, but we hadn't given them any support to explain what reflective writing is. Now, at that time, we had a 60-page document that spoke in quite academic terms about what reflective writing is and how people should use it. And if you think back to who our audience is, you can imagine why that didn't work. So it was obvious to us in the digital learning team that we couldn't just create content and create technology platforms and put it out there. We had to go out and facilitate. 200,000 people in terms of our audience. How does a team of 3 people go out and facilitate learning with all of those people? The solution had to be technology, but we just really didn't understand how to do it at that point. So we experimented. We started to identify services that were working really well. Now, the Scottish Social Services Council regulate the social services workforce. The Care Inspectorate is our sister body set up at the same time as we were. They inspect and regulate services, and they give services a score. So we started to look at the services that had really high scores at their last inspection, and we looked at, well, what's the difference between them and the services that have low scores in terms of how their workers learn? And this was it. Supervisors were fully involved in the learning and development in all the services that had really high scores, particularly high leadership scores. So we thought, how through the open badge activities can we get supervisors engaged in learning? So we decided, well, let's just put it in. Let's just put an activity in where you have to take everything you've done to your supervisor and get their opinion on it. We had to make it more likely that discussions about learning took place within the workforce. So we're talking about a culture change here where we're trying to encourage positive learning cultures within services that we have no control over. So we put in activities. Find 3 of your colleagues, have a discussion about what you've just learned. What does this mean in practice? And when you think about it, the learning materials made for social services are made for such a wide audience that there has to be some sort of exercise where this is put into context, and getting a group of your colleagues around the table to talk about it, even if it's only for 15 minutes, can be absolutely perfect. So we put that in as a badge activity too, and we say, look, once you've had that discussion, tell us a little bit about it when you submit your evidence for the badge. We also knew that everything we did when it came to CPD had to be about personal accountability. Now, our codes of practice state for registrants that you need to take accountability for your own learning. If your employer doesn't give you anything, you've got to go out and find it yourself, but we still put some effort. We still expect some effort from employers. But someone just can't sit through something that their employers laid on and then go back to the workplace and not even attempt to put any of it into practice. So within the reflective accounts, we're really strict on the fact that people write in first person and that people actually demonstrate, here's what personally I'm going to do, rather than what my organization might do to put this learning into practice. Study skills. This is what really took our Open Badges platform from 100 people using it, a few hundred people using it per month, to thousands of people using it per month. We put out a series of videos that explained in really basic terms how to use the platform and how to learn. So we took that 60-page document that explained reflective writing and we put it into a series of videos. We didn't expect this, but overnight, we more than, I think, almost by 4 times, we increased the number of people engaged with the platform. We weren't ready for it, so all those assessments that I had to do that people submitted, I went from maybe having to do 80 a month to having to do 500 to 600 a month. In fact, up to March, it was about 750 a month, just from those videos. And we did not expect that at all. So how are we using this in the context of policy? So in Scotland, the Scottish Government wants health and social services to be sort of lead in Europe. They want us to have the best social services in the whole of Europe. That means we have a lot of documents. We have a new set of health and social care standards, and these standards tend to get revised rapidly. So people will look at what's working, what's not working. The standards tend to change every 5 years at least. That can be quite daunting if you're working in this sector and you've got to stay up to date with everything. I visited one care home and I asked to actually see a copy of what was the previous version of this. It was called the National Care Standards. And up on a dusty shelf were all the copies of the National Care Standards. And I got promised that when learners or when workers started during their induction, they got at least half an hour with all these documents to go through them and understand what it meant to them. So when the new health and social care standards came out, we decided let's create a whole suite of badges around this. Now the important thing here is this is not a learning resource, this is a document. And the document talks about what the outcomes are for people who are receiving care in Scotland, and they're written from the perspective of someone actually receiving care. Each of these badges goes through a key factor. So we've got be included, compassion, well-being, and we ask learners to take each section of the document and identify something that they don't do at the moment that they will do now as the basis of what they've read. Now think about it, this document was released by Scottish Government because they wanted to improve or change the way services were working. What we started to see in the first couple of submissions for these is people go back to saying, I've always done this. It's very comfortable for learners to talk about what we've done for the last 10 years. Now these documents were released in March last year. It was remarkable how many people were giving us examples of things they did 4 years ago. So the benefit of the open badges, where we could release more support to learners, we put a short video up for these and we said, look, don't focus on what you're doing already, but focus on what you're not doing that you could do. For the first time, if someone says, Rob, what have you done to promote the health and social care standards? I can say, look, we've got a series of badges. We've issued, I think, somewhere in the region of about 3,500 of these badges. And if people want to go into more detail, we can start going into the reflective accounts. We can start pulling out what people are actually committing themselves to doing that makes a difference. And again, those stories coming back instead of just volumetrics about how many people are downloading the document is incredibly important. One of the things that happened there is we asked people to have conversations with their colleagues while they're going through the activities for the badges. That means colleagues who weren't aware of the badges are getting involved, and that's kind of encouraging engagement on a local scale. So just having that task in there where we say, go out and speak to your colleagues, is actually doing marketing for us, because in the past, I would put this out in an e-bulletin, and it would go out in an e-newsletter, and I'd maybe get a big peak of people looking at it, and then nobody would ever look at it again until we promoted it next time. By doing it this way, we're getting a lot of organic growth, where we're seeing maybe 200 to 300 submissions for these badges coming in every month. If it's every week, I think I'll almost be out of a job. There's a couple of things I wanted to share with you that we learned from the entire process that was really useful for us in terms of engagement, and these are our engagement top tips. First of all, for our audience, we are really shocked about how popular video was. And people have told us that they prefer video to sitting in front of a PowerPoint clicking next. They'd rather have somebody talk to them about it, to actually tell them what's different. A lot of people who said they weren't learners when we spoke to them seem to spend an awful lot of time looking at things on YouTube. Now, something's happened recently on YouTube. A lot of people who use social services in Scotland, maybe family members of people living with dementia, have taken to YouTube to talk about their stories and about the impact that that has on them. And workers have been going to YouTube, watching these videos and thinking, well, I did training on dementia a few years ago, but I never thought that could be the impact if I didn't do exactly what it had asked for in the training. So people were starting to rethink about what something meant and about how they might be able to change something that they're doing. So I'd really advise, if you're having trouble with engagement when it comes to learning and development, consider video just as an alternative to traditional e-learning. One thing that really struck us is to keep it simple and to help learners focus. There's a brilliant article I read recently by Dawn Taylor, which talks about learning and development professionals being curators of content. And that, for me, I think was quite important, because one of the jobs that we have to do is to help people focus on what's important. Now, with open badges, what we do is we say, if you come to an event like this, don't try and do everything. Don't try and, for every presentation that you hear, try and put something into practice. We say, what was the most important thing for you? Try to do at least one thing when you get back into the workplace. Change one thing in your practice that makes you better that day than you were the day before. And then once you've done that, think about the other things you could apply. Because we found that a lot of our learners were just getting overwhelmed by the amount of content and the amount of things we were asking them to do. We went out to try and find inspirational people who we knew, who we could either get on camera in videos, and within our digital learning team at the SSSC, we now have a professional videographer on staff. I think that's one of the best decisions we've ever made, because it's really improved the quality of our videos, but it means we can send her out to interview people, and we can get those interviews into our learning resources. But the more inspirational someone is, the more demand we have from learners to get that person in the videos again. There are people now who in our sector are becoming almost YouTube stars, because workers really like them, because they might have been workers, they may have been relatives of people being looked after in one of the services. But people really like them. They're charismatic, they can explain something, and I think someone had mentioned yesterday that the worst person to get on video is somebody who spent their entire life in front of a flip chart, and that can be quite true. What we need to do is find somebody that people will relate to. within organizations, we've definitely found that a big difference that can be made by services that aren't performing well in terms of them changing and going on a journey to services that perform really well is that there's at least one individual in those services who has committed themselves to drive change. And we always say that people should be drivers of their own change, that if you're going to do something in your L&D, if you're going to do something in your learning and development, you need to take that forward. You need to be committed. Don't wait for someone else to do that. In fact, just trying to copy from someone else's presentation yesterday. The difficulty with being on the second day is most people have already said everything you wanted to say. But people need to take responsibility for this, and our Open Badges platform would not have worked if there weren't 3 of us in the organization who really said, look, we're going to keep pushing this. Because we didn't get paid for all of it. Sometimes we spent a lot of hours unpaid trying to work on things, trying to experiment, trying to get it to work. But if you can get someone in your organization who's willing to help you push something through, it's going to happen. There's nothing that you can't do. One thing I will say, and this is specifically when it comes to technology as well, there is absolutely no silver bullet. When I started in L&D, when I made the transition from working in a communications team looking after websites to creating learning resources and trying to facilitate learning, I made one of the mistakes of going out and reading about all these wonderful learning theories. Has anyone ever heard of the learning triangle? It was this thing that only 5% of things that people hear will actually be remembered. It was absolute rubbish. It was being ridiculed in a lot of papers. But because I was new to the field, I read it and thought, wow, that must be how it works. After a few experiments, we realized that is not how it works at all. So I'd say that what I've said, go out and try it in your own organization. Don't take my word for it, because what works for one organization might not necessarily work for another. But the important thing is, don't ever, ever give up. I've often got frustrated about how slow change can be. I've got a 15-year plan for where we're going to take Open Badges in Scotland to the next couple of years, but we just got to keep working on it. I think the question is, that you might want to ask yourself is, what do I sometimes feel like giving up on that could actually make a difference if I don't? And if the only thing you take away from my presentation is not to give up on something, then that would be wonderful. I'd love to know about that. I think that's it for my presentation.
There you go. Excellent. I was reminded that the Learning Pyramid, the first ever blog I ever wrote about 10, 12 years ago, was basically why the Learning Pyramid is nonsense, was that first blog. Unfortunately, there are fewer people read that blog than read about the Learning Pyramid, which is obviously where the problem is. I think that was really useful. Some great ideas in there. We are ever so slightly short of time, so once again, we'll ask Rob to hang around and people can grab him. If you've got a burning question, I'm sure he would be happy to answer it. It's great to see people doing fantastic levels of innovation within organizations where innovation is not expected, where people are not supposed to be doing things that are unusual or exciting and worrying about engagement and what that engagement means. And isn't it great that we're starting to talk with pride about the idea of reflection? For years, because some pillock came up with a learning styles questionnaire, we've all been thinking that reflectors are a bit dull and they're not like us. Let's hear it for the reflecting geeks, I say. So would you join me once again? Thank Rob Stewart from the Scottish Social Services Council.